And good morning, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called Macduff Lives, and the Ospreys are welcoming us back as we welcome the Ospreys back here to Mystery Island. They arrived in droves over the last couple of weeks, and you may even hear them doing their famous eeks outside the window today. Anyway, it's a Tuesday morning, 11 o'clock, and over in Potsdam, Germany, I think it's a little bit later, is it not, Harley Schlanger?
Yeah, it's a few minutes after 5 here.
Okay, and welcome to the show. Thanks for coming back to give us some more interesting conversation about what's really going on in the world today.
Well, good to see you and good to hear the Ospreys.
Okay, well, we are in the middle of a huge amount of news from foreign sources where it seems to me that we don't really, I don't know, I don't watch mainstream news anymore, but the American people are just not informed of what's going on in places like Ukraine and many other places around the world where you've mentioned. But one of the big issues that we face in trying to talk to the American people is you say, well, like I say, like there's this deep state or Garland Nixon calls it the blob. There's something behind the scenes that we can't really describe. And unless we can describe the whole elephant to them, they don't believe it when you say, here's the tusk and here's the foot and here's the tail. They just don't believe it. American media is controlled. My small channel and your great effort all are on the same team trying to really just reveal the truth as much as we can, find the truth and reveal it both in historical terms and in terms of what's going on right now in the present day. So I guess I would just open up for you and let us know, Harley, what's number one thing on your mind this morning in foreign affairs in particular.
Well, over at the Schiller Institute and the Larouche Organization, we're putting up the red flags on the situation now in Ukraine. And this is a potentially very dangerous situation. It's been in the news a little bit lately, but mostly the mainstream media is reporting that the Russians, quote unquote, shot some Ukrainian soldiers. And they're insisting that the Russians are all over, the Russian military is all over eastern Ukraine, the Donbas region, as it's called, and that the Russians have a malign intent. And the argument is that Putin is now pressuring NATO to put pressure on Biden to see what he's going to do. Now, I think that's a pile of nonsense. It's cooked up by the same people who came up with Iraq's weapons of mass destruction and the same people who are talking about the Uyghur concentration camps in China, same people who talked about Assad's use of chemical weapons. You have a war party, or better yet, it should be, as it's known sometimes, the military-industrial complex, which includes think tanks that have constant sessions to promote the line that Putin is evil, Russia is expansionist, China is aggressive, they're intimidating their neighbors, they're moving against the NATO, and therefore the United States has to be prepared for something. Now, two events in the last week, Biden had a discussion with Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, in which he assured him that the US will guarantee Ukraine's sovereignty, as if that's an issue. And then General Austin, the defense secretary from Raytheon, spoke with the Ukrainian defense minister and said, don't worry, we're behind you 100%. Now, what's the issue here? Well, there was an agreement signed by the US, France, Germany, and Ukraine and Russia called the Minsk Accord, which everyone agreed there should be autonomy for the eastern regions of Ukraine, which are largely ethnic Russians. Russian is the main language spoken there. This is where, during the time of the Soviet Union, you had a lot of advanced industry and military technology and so on produced there, relatively high standard of living and education. But when the coup took place in Ukraine in February 2014, with Biden as the point man for Obama, the Kiev government insisted that all of Ukraine, including the eastern region, be brought under control of Kiev. And there was clearly, I mean, there's a history there. The government in Kiev includes Nazi SS descendants. And this is not an exaggeration. The Bandera Brigade, named after Stefan Bandera, who was a collaborator of the SS when they took over Ukraine in '43. The Azov Battalion, they marched with Nazi symbols. They exterminated Hungarians, Romanians, Russians, Poles, and Jews during World War II. So when these people ended up running the coup in February 2014 and came to power in the defense ministry and the security forces, the people in the eastern Ukraine insisted on self-defense and a Russian security blanket if they needed it, and there was fighting there. The Minsk Protocol argued that these areas should have limited autonomy. The Ukrainian government has not granted that yet. And so every once in a while, it's sort of like you poke the bear to see what the Russians are going to do. Every year, the Russians have maneuvers on the border there because that borders Russia. And the whole intent of the Ukraine coup in 2014 was to bring Ukraine into NATO and the European Union so that NATO would be right on the Russian border. So this is a very dangerous thing to be playing around with. And unfortunately, we had Joe Biden calling Putin a killer on television. We have these promises from NATO that don't worry, we'll back you up completely. And so far, the Russians have basically said, look, we have no intention of doing anything. Actually, I should add one other thing. The Ukrainian government cut off the water supply for Crimea. And so the Ukrainians are now saying the Russians are going to come in and capture a portion of Ukraine where the river is to make sure there's water. Now, the Russians are still trying to negotiate with the Ukrainian government over that, unsuccessfully so far. So it's a mess. And the reason it's such a mess is that Biden is trying to assert his authority. And there are a whole series of events taking place at the Center for New American Security, the Council on Foreign Relations, and our favorite, the Atlantic Council, talking about aggressive Russia. Russia has to be pushed back. So that's why this becomes so dangerous, and most Americans have no clue.
Yeah, most Americans have no clue by design of the people who control our media, and those are the same people that are pushing for this confrontation with Russia. So are we not now living in a fascist state, Harley?
Well, we're certainly seeing elements that are extremely disturbing with the censorship. But here's the interesting thing. The people who accuse Trump of being a fascist, what did Trump do that actually usurped the democratic power of the state? And up to this point, Biden has not moved to do that, except supporting the censorship and demanding more censorship. And what the main element of this is not really so much the government, but what we were talking about at the beginning, the so-called deep state, the people behind the government. Now, that's where you have a danger of fascism, because what we're seeing is a merger of the defense sector, the defense contractors, the mercenary brigades of the CIA, and so on, who are working together with the globalists of the banking and financial community, the big pharma, the oil and raw material cartels. And their idea is that they will establish authorities over and above sovereign states, and that sovereign states will have their powers usurped by these international agreements, whether it's free trade agreements or a Green New Deal or things of that sort. So in that sense, John, we are moving perilously close to the traditional definition of what is fascism, which started in Italy, but all over Europe, you had these corporate cartels that took power. And that's essentially what we mean when we talk about fascism.
And I would just lay on top of that the important gloss, which is that this is not a national fascism. This is not a national thing. This is an international empire. Is the way I think the best word for it is an empire that is being imposed by these oligarchical elites that control the banks and the corporations that you just mentioned. And that's the way I've started thinking of it. That we have these kind of almost two-dimensional nation states, but then there's this three-dimensional empire that kind of is able to move right across lines, just cross any line it wants to, and shake down governments, take down and remove people, exercise the most immoral, violent policies necessary just to get what they want, such as a pipeline through Syria, for example.
Well, or take one of the most egregious examples, that you have the United States and the British working hand in hand to silence, not to silence Julian Assange, but to punish him and to send a signal to any publisher who would tell the truth about what governments are doing. And the fact that the Biden administration is pursuing the extradition to bring Julian Assange to the United States, stick him in one of these prisons where he's in solitary confinement 90% of the time. Even a British judge made the decision that this is not a good idea for someone who has health issues and who's actually been suffering by being isolated the way he has for years. But what's Assange's crime? That he published actual documents of US military and intelligence agencies, which showed these agencies were engaged in the commission of war crimes, universally acknowledged war crimes. And so instead of bringing to trial people like John Brennan and the various CIA directors who did it, the ones who were running the global spy operations, the global surveillance state, instead of punishing them, they're trying to silence Assange to send a message to anyone else who might tell the truth about what they're doing. So when you see things like that, it makes it clear that we're dealing with minimally an evil network, but one which is using or carrying out evil for the sake of a bigger strategy. And the bigger strategy is, as we talked about last time I was on, and I know you've been talking with some of my associates at the Larouche Organization, the bigger strategy is the Great Reset. They see a collapsing financial system that they're going to try and prop up with a green financial bubble, while imposing policies that cannot support or sustain 7 billion people. And so we face the most dangerous aspect of this, which is the elimination of whole sections of the human population.
Yeah, we keep talking about that on my show. It seems to be a concern right across the board with all of my guests, as well as most of the folks in the chat room. Often are now looking at this suggestion that the real policy is depopulation, and you've said it. I've seen many very well respected people say it. The media, of course, is never going to talk about it, but is they deindustrialize, as you all have published in the Schiller Institute's great book about it, the Great Leap Backwards, how Lyndon LaRouche exposes the Green New Deal, a book that everyone should get a hold of by going to larouchepub.com. And that exposition is just completely not on the radar screen. But now, the other thing that I would add into that is I have read that, and I do believe that I've got enough resources or sources to put this out there, Harley, that a lot of these diseases like Ebola and whatnot have been tested on human beings in Africa and South America and other places we may not even know about, including in the America, for instance, but using the vaccine as a way to sterilize people, to include something in the vaccine that's going to inhibit the propagation of children by that person that got vaccinated. And I just have to toss that out there. I don't know your opinion on it, but in my opinion, it seems like that may be part of the overall strategy that we're looking at.
Well, we've seen that done in the United States, the so-called Tuskegee experiment in
Yeah.
the 1930s, where African Americans were basically sterilized. I don't think it was a vaccine. I think it was just something that was done to them.
Didn't treat it. That's all. They
Yeah.
just let them die of it. Of
And,
syphilis.
this is the eugenics movement, which starts with this idea that certain people are genetically superior and that other people are less worthy of life, then becomes a concept of useless eaters. And before Hitler was applying this to the Jews and Gypsies and other minorities in Germany, this was actually being put forward in New York City. The Eugenics Society, which included the Harrimans, the Rockefellers, Prescott Bush was part of this, very prominent people. In fact, the same people who funded the corporate cartels that later funded Hitler. And they had conferences where they advocated immigration restriction because we didn't want lesser people brought into our country. This idea of discriminating, bring a certain amount of people in so that you can have an underclass that you can work in slave labor type conditions, but you don't want them to have any equality. You don't want to have them have any rights. And this was the eugenics movement, the Pioneer Fund. There were a whole bunch of these things before World War II. And the famous Julian Huxley, who was the founder of UNESCO, actually said in 1946 that while the policies of the Nazis were legitimately abhorrent, however, we do have to concern ourselves with overpopulation. And we do have to concern ourselves with protecting the human race from lesser peoples. And Huxley was one of the promoters of eugenics. Now, he said he and others stopped using that term because of its association with the death camps of Germany. But in reality, when we see things today, and let me just say something on this question of the diseases, because in the mid 70s, and I'm sorry, the mid 80s, Lyndon LaRouche put out a warning when we were watching AIDS develop, and we were watching other diseases. And what he said is that if you tear down health systems or don't have health systems built up, for example, in Africa, you have places where there's no clean water, there's no electricity, there's no access to hospitals. If you have situations like that and you have malnutrition, and then you have spread of diseases, locusts, things of that sort, you essentially have a human petri dish for the development of new, more dangerous pandemic diseases. And this doesn't even consider the possibility of biologically create the human creation of these diseases. It just happens. This is part of nature. And LaRouche warned of a biological holocaust if we didn't stop the policies of the International Monetary Fund and the colonial powers that enforced backwardness on these countries. Now, where are we today? We've got parts of the world where you have, according to the World Food Organization, up to 230 million people facing starvation this spring and summer in parts of Africa, in parts of the Arabian Peninsula, in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen because of the war there, Syria because of Pompeo's sanctions. So we're spreading poverty and hunger and disease. Remember, one of the things Clinton did with the sanctions against Iraq after the 91 war ended up killing 500,000 Iraqi children. Now, these are essentially human rights violations. The State Department puts out a report on the dubious report on China, and meanwhile covers up the genocide that is knowingly committed by U.S. institutions. So this is where the danger of apathy or indifference comes in. And the American people tend to be empathetic, tend to be desirous of a better life for people in other countries, but not to the extent they'll get off their rear ends and do something about it. And so we're putting this out there for people to recognize that while we're legitimately worried about the effects of the lockdown and the shutting down of our favorite cafe and bistro, there are parts of the world where there's millions of people who have food insufficiency, meaning children are going hungry. And that's including in American cities. So it's this indifference, John. We talk about never again. How did the German people let this happen? We're letting it happen. And this happened under Obama. It happened under Trump. At least with Trump, David Beasley of the World Food Organization started blowing the whistle about it, blowing his horn about it. But it's going on under Joe Biden, your good old Uncle Joe. What do they call him? Lunchbox, or I can't remember the term he uses. But turning our back on the misfortune of hundreds of millions of people while we're continuing to fund a militaristic security state, provoking Ukraine to start a war with Russia. So this is, when you talk about the dangers that we face, this is what we're looking at.
Well, if I were looking to depopulate the world at any cost, I'd be happy with all this stuff. Let's make everybody sick. Let's destroy all the good water systems, and then let's buy up the rest of them. So that if you want some nice water, you'll be paying me, more than it costs for a gallon of gas. You'd be buying water just to survive. That is pure capitalism. That is the purest Malthusian policy of just let them die. If they're going to die, that's not on us. Just let them die. You have to be brought up in a way that accepts that to do what people do today. I think of these oligarchical families from Italy to Great Britain to New England, California, and all over the place. The oligarchy must have some secret training for their kids to say, remember this thing about empathy and all. Well, you don't need that. You don't need empathy. And that's all that's for fools.
That's for losers.
It's made of fools, and you and I, we're with one of the very small group of people that are smart enough to see that. So, don't worry about all the little people. I think Queen Elizabeth was quoted saying something about her little people one time. And anyway, let me ask you, if you would, could you indulge a couple questions that I'm just, they just occur to me as we talk. And
if you just let me add one more point then to this question of what we're facing. There are solutions which are not so expensive, which actually are natural solutions. And one of the ones that we've been promoting just came into the news again because the president of Nigeria came forward and said, this is something we must do. You've got a lake called Lake Chad, which is shrinking dramatically. It's about 40, 50, 60% reduced in the last 2 decades. There are 30 to 40 million people who are dependent on Lake Chad for their living standards. There are about 6 or 7 countries surrounding it. And there's a group of Italian engineers who put forward a proposal for diverting 2% of the water of the Congo River to move it northward into Lake Chad to replenish the fresh water there, which would be a blessing for those people and would avoid the desertification moving further south. But more importantly, what's going to happen if 30 to 40 million people lose their life, the water they need for life? Well, they're going to become refugees. Where are they going to go? They're going to go to Europe. And what is this going to do? So this is really significant to look at something that was on the books going back to the late 1970s. The Italian company Bonifica developed it. It's still possible now. In fact, the Lake Chad Basin Initiative came out in favor of this. The Chinese said they're willing to fund it. Who's against it? The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. They're saying, well, you're diverting water from the Congo. This water just flows into the ocean if it's not diverted. But they're also saying that this infects, this has a problem with border disputes, and all these things that they bring up are nonsense. The nations of the region would all benefit from this policy. So there are simple solutions, but this is where we get back to what we were talking about earlier. The oligarchs don't care. They figure 30 to 40 million people try to come to Europe, you can build a wall in the middle of the Mediterranean or something to keep them out, or they'll all drown, or they'll be shot down by NATO in the Mediterranean. So this is really one of the tragedies of our modern period, where the indifference enables the oligarchs to carry out brutal policies of murder.
They have so much power. They have so much military with them, with NATO, and you mentioned the Atlantic Council as a very important policy institution. And what can stop them now? What can stop them besides you and I doing our best to spread the word? I don't know. It's a tragedy that always reminds me of President Kennedy and his inaugural address, and the tragedy that followed for Patrice Lumumba. And here we are saying we want to help you, we want to mentor you. And if President Kennedy had lived and his policies had been followed, Africa would be thriving today. Africa would be a very, very well-developed and healthy and prosperous place with all those resources they have. That's what I think that it really comes down to, is if you are willing to be human in relation to people of countries that you haven't conquered yet, then you're not going to survive, because we have to use inhuman means to take over all of that land, all their resources. And, Africa could be doing very, very well if they just had organized governments that could let the people develop their own resources. That's what President Kennedy wanted to do, and that's what every administration since him, in my opinion, has quashed, because of the obligations that they have, within their oligarchical connections that ultimately, I guess, constitute the deep state.
Well, Andy's just been scrolling something very instructive, which is the recent schedule of events at the Atlantic Council, where you see a number of conferences on Russia, conferences on China, conferences on Turkey. Everywhere there's a crisis, they bring in people who have significant influence in government policy and corporate policy. They're funded largely by the military-industrial complex, and they shape the narratives. And I just was going back and looking at this flare-up around Ukraine. Joe Biden is vice president 2 months after the Maidan coup, which he oversaw as Obama's point man for Ukraine, working together with Victoria Nuland, who's a neocon with total credentials with the neoconservative War Party. Her husband's Robert Kagan, one of the founders of the Project of a New American Century. Biden's bringing Nuland back into his administration. She oversaw $5 billion of American spending that went into the coup in Ukraine. Now, 2 months after the coup, Biden gave an address at the Atlantic Council. And what did he say? He said, "What's the crisis we have today with NATO?" He said, "It has nothing to do with the enlargement of NATO," which is a total lie, because the US promised the Russians and the Germans that we would not expand NATO eastward if Russia accepted the peaceful dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, which they did. They may not have had an alternative, but they didn't fight. They let it happen. So Biden said that had nothing to do with the crisis. It was born in the Kremlin. It was born in Putin's mind. And he describes himself as a proud Atlanticist, a believer that NATO and the transatlantic relationship has never been more relevant than they are today. Well, what are you talking about? NATO was set up to stop the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union from overrunning Europe after World War II. The Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. Russia is not a threat to Europe. And Biden went on to say, and this is again 2014, when it comes to energy, Russia should not be able to use its resources as a political weapon against its neighbor. No, only we should be allowed to do that. The US, Blinken said this again a couple of days ago, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline to bring natural gas to Germany and 12 other European countries from Russia should be shut down. It should not be allowed to be completed. So where's the free trade? Where's the rules-based order? It doesn't exist. It's rules to defend this oligarchy we've been talking about. And I think you ask, how do you fight it? Well, first of all, you have to expose it, which is what you and I are doing now. But there are policies you can implement which will change it, which will defeat the power of these institutions. And one of those is a bankruptcy reorganization of the financial system. Instead of a great reset to give more power to these private banks and the central banks, we have to put these banks through bankruptcy reorganization. Look what just happened in the last week with the Archegos fiasco. You had major banks, including JP Morgan Chase, Credit Suisse, you lose billions of dollars when the derivatives contract, the equity derivatives, unwound. We had a similar thing happening with the internecine warfare between different hedge funds over the GameStop. These are institutions that are bankrupt. They're counting on a new financial bubble, including Biden's so-called infrastructure plan, including the $30 to $40 trillion they think will be made available through the Great Reset to keep these bubbles and these going and keep the debt on the books. Well, if we could get a few people in the Congress with guts, which we don't have right now, but if we could get a few people to push through legislation for restoring Glass-Steagall, for anti-monopoly measures against the social media companies, there are steps that can be taken that would take their power away from them. But mostly we have to hit the monetary power. And I was hoping that Donald Trump would do this because he campaigned in 2016 for restoring Glass-Steagall. Once he got in, he brought in people like Gary Cohn and Mnuchin, who were opposed to restoring Glass-Steagall, who were part of the group that got rid of Glass-Steagall to allow for the commercial banks to engage in speculation through investment banking and so on. So, this is the blob we're fighting. They want the world casino to continue unimpeded. And if they lose money, they want to get bailed out. If businesses get shut down and the people lose money, they have to lose their homes, lose their savings, lose everything. That's not right because there are hundreds of millions who lose when this happens and a few thousand that benefit. And if the American people understood this is deliberate policy and that we can use the Congress to change it, this is what Kennedy was trying to do with the actions against the Federal Reserve in June of '63. So, history, economic science, real political education, that's the only thing that will work. And then you need some people with real courage. And I think when President Trump had the opportunity to do these things, I think he blinked. I think he backed down and figured he would use his second term to carry this stuff out.
I have, well, what you just said, it kind of made me think back, and I never thought of Kennedy as having blinked, but I think what you say is, I mean, in a nutshell, I guess that's I would accept that, but it wasn't like he just threw up his hands and said no. I think he took a very sober look at things and made a judgment that the best way to accomplish it is a little bit is to get the second term. Well, anyway, that's just my opinion.
John, I think the problem Kennedy had is that he was doing most of this behind the scenes. And that's what enabled them to mobilize to kill him and to carry out his removal from office. President Trump did at least bring some of this into the public, but he blinked when it came to really doing it. Why did we not get a public declassification of all the documents that would have shown who was involved in organizing Russiagate as a criminal conspiracy against a duly elected president? You don't think the president has the power to do that? He can lock himself in a secure location, bring in trusted bodyguards, and send out the orders. It could have been done. But I think he was being told by people like McConnell and others that if you go against these guys, well, actually, Schumer said it the first week of the Trump presidency. Remember, he said that Trump can't go against the intelligence community because they have 6 ways from Sunday to get you. That was the first week of the presidency, and Schumer threatened Trump. And Trump is very well aware of what happened to John Kennedy. But you need to if you're going to run for president saying you're going to clean up the swamp, you have to go ahead and carry it out. And I don't blame President Trump. I blame a lot of the people who were his allies who didn't give him the backup that he needed, because he did fight. And he fought effectively on some of these flanks, but not on others.
Chuck Schumer.
Senator from Wall Street.
The senator from Wall Street, indeed. Let me ask you this, and I'm sure you've been studying him a long time. One of the early quotes on him was by William Cooper, the author of Behold a Pale Horse, a very early whistleblower whose work is still worth studying, I think. But one of the things that he said was that Chuck Schumer is a Nazi. And I thought to myself, wow, this is somebody saying that way back in the earlier times of his career. And now let's bounce that against what we see here with the Azov Brigade and the Banderas, and say, well, excuse me, Mr. Senator from Wall Street, and one of the great friends of Israel, a proud Zionist. How in conscience can you support these Nazis?
Well, I think it was in the late 80s, a couple of associates of mine, Anton Chaikin and Webster Tarpley, wrote a book called The Unauthorized Biography of George H.W. Bush. And I was involved in doing a lot of research for that. But one of the things that Anton Chaikin dug up was the documents which showed that a bank which had Prescott Bush and Roland Harriman as its 2 American members of the board of directors, the Union Bank Corporation of New York, was seized in 1942 by the Justice Department under the Trading with the Enemy Act, that they were continuing to send money to supporters of Hitler, including in this case in particular Fritz Thyssen, who wrote a book called I Financed Hitler. But this was part of the New York banking cartel, which included the Morgan Group, the Rockefeller Group, the Citibank Group, City of New York at the time. They were providing funds to the forces in Germany who were backing Hitler. Now, when we put this into a book, this was a scandal. Probably today that book wouldn't be allowed to be published. But one of the consequences of the publication of the book was they closed off a whole section of the US archives where you could go in and find these documents. So the important thing is that we knew, and by the way, the Harrimans, what was important about the Harrimans is that they were the ones who sponsored in 1932 a dinner in New York City honoring a man named Ernst Rudin, who later became Hitler's Minister of Race. And Rudin, at that banquet in New York City, praised the Harriman networks and the eugenics networks in the United States. And he said, how I wish we could be so open in what we're doing in Germany. So, when you look at someone like a Schumer, or you look at someone like a Biden, who minimally is turning his head away to ignore the fact that there are Nazis in the Ukraine government that we financed and supported. Now, this is a stain, a horrible stain on the history of the United States. And it's something that has to be overcome. And, to this day, I was just watching a discussion the other day Max Blumenthal, who you may know from the Gray Zone, he talked about when he exposed the Azov battalion as Nazis, he was getting hate mail, he was getting canceled. People were trying to keep him out of the media. But what he was saying was the truth. And one of the people who attacked him was, and I want to make sure I get the name right because this is something that's quite startling, Michael Carpenter, who was the head of the Biden Center at the University of Pennsylvania, a longtime Biden aide on Russia and Ukraine, who's now back in the government. Michael Carpenter was escorting Andrei Padubuy, who is the leader of one of the Nazi groups in Ukraine. He was escorting him around the Congress after the Maidan coup. And when Max Blumenthal exposed this, he was subjected to a series of hateful tweets and attempts to cancel his public addresses and things of that sort. There he is, Michael Carpenter. This is a guy who is currently, I believe, one of the top aides to Joe Biden when it comes to Ukraine and Russia policy. So there's the face of the man who is openly supporting a Nazi formation inside Ukraine.
It's truly remarkable that the American, average American Jewish person would not be aware of and be horrified by this connection.
And by the way, this guy Carpenter is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council.
Okay, well, we were going to talk about the Atlantic Council a little bit. Let's turn there. It's a good pivot, and bring us up to date as to what's going on with them, and remind us how important this body is and its connection to NATO.
Well, it was established in 1961 to promote the idea of a North Atlantic Western Europe alliance, particularly on economic policy, particularly on free trade, but it soon became one of the leading proponents of NATO policy on both sides of the Atlantic. And it's heavily funded by who's who of the military industrial complex, including the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office. The United Arab Emirates Embassy gave them over $1 million a number of years in a row. All the oil companies, the defense contractors, Raytheon, things of that sort. And what they have done is they've set up what's essentially a think tank with muscle that has people going in and out of the government and also in and out of other think tanks, like the Center for New American Security, which was the replacement of the Project for a New American Century. These are voices of American British unilateralism. And they talk about a rules-based order. But who makes the rules? Who are the rules for? And what's the purpose of the rules? It's to protect the City of London and Wall Street, which is integrated into this military industrial complex. Now, I participated in one of their conferences, online conferences recently, with a Senator Sullivan from Alaska, a Republican, who's now the head of the International Republican Institute, which is one of these agencies that funds regime change around the world. And what Sullivan said was really quite interesting because I hadn't heard someone say this so openly. This was the week after the Alaska summit in which Blinken and Jake Sullivan basically said to the Chinese, you're outlaws, you're outside of the existing world order, you're against the rules-based system, and you better straighten up or you're going to have trouble. You had a tough exchange, which is not the best way to start the relationship. Well, here's Sullivan, a Trump-supporting Republican, and what did he say? I was very impressed with the way this was handled by Blinken and Jake Sullivan, no relation. He said, I was very impressed by it. And here's the best part of it. Through the work of the Atlantic Council and other institutions, we now have a bipartisan recognition that Russia and China are malign actors and that the American government has to stand firm, has to have a military buildup, has to create new alliances such as the so-called Quad partnership or the Asia NATO. They're reviving the Atlantic Council, went so far as to revive the idea of the founding document of NATO, the long telegram of George Kennan, which called for containing the Soviet Union after World War II. They published something called the longer telegram, which not only called for containing and encircling China, but called for running operations inside the Chinese Communist Party to build up opposition to President Xi. Now, this is not an independent think tank, as you saw with the Carpenter, as you see with a number of other people. They go in and out of US government. And so the Atlantic Council is, in a sense, one of these shadow institutions, which has a certain amount of academic credentials and a certain amount of distance, but nevertheless, it's a flow through government agencies. Their personnel serve in the government, then they come out, then they, one of the people who spoke at this event was the former brigadier general who commanded NATO, Stavridis, Admiral Stavridis. So this is what you're dealing with. You're dealing with private institutions that are heavily funded, including by government, that have policies that become the policies of the governments. And it doesn't matter who's in the Congress. It doesn't matter who's criticizing them. These are the institutions that have power. And I think it's important people should take a look at these things. And as Andy was putting up on the screen before, they have 2 or 3 seminars a week. And who's on there? The average American? No, the people who make policy.
We haven't even gotten through the A's yet, and he's still scrolling. It's going to go on for an hour if we want to look at all of these.
By the way, this one
fellows.
Emma Ashford, she and another person came out with a statement a few weeks ago saying that maybe we should not be so ready to condemn Russia and get into a confrontation. And 22 other senior fellows denounced them and said that, no, we must proceed with sanctions. We must show Putin that we're not going to tolerate his malign influence. And so the Atlantic Council played this up as, oh, see, we have democratic debate. Mm-hmm. But the 2 people who questioned it were put in their place very, very quickly by the majority of the so-called Russia experts at the Atlantic Council.
Let me then, this is a question that's been in the back of my mind because I remember that story. I didn't remember the ladies, there was 2 of them and I don't remember their names, but the story I read said they were funded by the Koch brothers or Koch, however you say those guys, the notorious Republican money bags behind the scenes like Adelson. The Kochs are not very popular among the progressive people of the world, but did they actually have a voice in this policy, or was it just a kind of a school play for us to watch?
I'm not sure what their role is. I know that what we're beginning to see is some of the people in business institutions, the Chamber of Commerce and others, are beginning to realize that if you slap sanctions on everybody, pretty soon we're not going to have anybody to trade with. For example, we're putting sanctions against German companies that participated in the building of the Nord Stream pipeline. They're not part of a Putin aggressive assault on the West. They're trying to provide cheap, reliable energy to their customers. Now, if there are American firms that are involved with them, they'll be sanctioned also. Banks that loan to these companies are subject to sanctions. So people in the business community, including here in Germany, are beginning to raise the question, where do you stop with sanctions? And you probably just saw a minute ago from the scrolling Andy was doing that there's a whole panel of so-called sanctions experts at the Atlantic Council. And so we're seeing these kinds of interruptions of normal business practices. There's a lot of anger about this, but
my dog was really pissed when you said that.
I was afraid that was my dog.
That's Toto.
Okay. Well, but this is really something that is a new approach to policy. But what happens, just to go back to the Syria question for a moment, if you take a country that's been in a civil war, a devastating civil war for 10 years fighting against Islamic fundamentalists, they finally pretty much win the war, although there's still a part of the country that's controlled by the US where their oil is and where there are wheat fields. Then you have sanctions against companies to not, so they're not providing food and shipments of medicine to that country. And you have people starting to die. Now, Pompeo justified it by saying that that's the best thing we can do to bring down the Assad regime. And this is now the same line that Blinken has. So, regime change to try to convince the people of Syria the only way they're ever going to get food and have peace is if they bring down a government that they voted for.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the what the Atlantic Council and these kind of institutions represent as policy influencers.
I see the connection, and the more we talk, the more connections I see, Harley. It's just such a pleasure to be able to spend an hour with you every couple of weeks. And wow, thanks a lot for this morning. Well, I don't really know what to say in terms of except for that all of this stuff is all tied together, and the history of it and the presence of it right now. One of the big questions I have is, is Russia, are Russia and China really independent countries, or are they just represent another part of the overall cabal and their struggling three-way struggle to see who wins?
Well, that's a subject for 2 weeks from today, maybe. But I think the thing people should realize is that President Putin saw what happened when Russia gave up its sovereignty in the 1990s. They had a demographic collapse. And the Chinese also saw what happened from the middle of the 19th century until the end of the 20th century because of their control, the control of finance and trade and isolation from other countries. And so, in the case of both of them, they're not going to give up their sovereignty unless it's something that benefits their country, which they're not going to get from these globalists. So they represent a point of opposition to this great reset. And that's why they're targeted by the same people who targeted Donald Trump. And so you have this disconnect where people who recognize the attacks on Trump where they came from, but don't recognize it's the same people who are going against Putin and against Xi Jinping. I would encourage people to be in touch with me, be in touch with my colleagues, read our publications, the Executive Intelligence Review. I do a daily 10-minute or 12-minute update that's available for free for anyone who wants it. And if you're interested, write to me at my email address, harleysch@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to send you the link to our website so you can have access to this kind of material to go out and evangelize with us to get people to recognize that we have a tradition as a sovereign Republican constitutional nation state that we're not living up to, and that this is one of the great threats to continued existence of humanity if we can't win it back.
Harley Schlanger, thank you a million. I'm going to put one last 30 seconds to put a plug in for your colleague at the Larouche Organization, Diane Sare, S-A-R-E, because we were speaking of Chuck Schumer a little while ago and what a malign influence, in my opinion, he's been for his career. You have an alternative in Diane Sare, who's going to be running as an independent against Senator Schumer at the next election. So we'll be talking to her here on McDuff Lives April 30th at 8 p.m. So I look forward to that. And with that, once again, thank you, Harley, and we'll be back again with you, I hope, soon in another couple of weeks.
Okay, John. Good talking with you today.
Bye now.